In 1977, a young policewoman from a small California coastal town disappeared without a trace while on routine night patrol. Everyone assumed she had simply abandoned duty and gone into hiding, until 13 years later, a fisherman discovered something shocking at the base of a remote cliff. Her rusty patrol car emerged from the waves, with evidence inside revealing a horrifying truth about that night, a truth that shattered the quiet facade of a community that thought it knew peace. This is the story of Deputy Sarah Jenkins, her last watch, and the dark secret the Pacific held for over a decade. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe if you believe the truth always comes out eventually. The patrol car's tires hummed softly against the asphalt, a familiar lullaby on the back roads, winding through the sleepy coastal town in the late autumn of 1977. Deputy Sarah Jenkins gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white just under the dashboard's dim glow. The air in the cruiser smelled faintly of stale coffee, old paperwork, and the damp, salty breath of the nearby Pacific, a scent mingling strangely with the drier, earthy smell of redwood and pine that drifted down from the hills flanking the town. This stretch of the coast, nestled between towering bluffs and quiet forest, felt both like a sanctuary and a cage. Most nights were predictable. The occasional barking dog complaint, teenagers loitering down at the pier, the rhythmic, comforting clang of the buoy bell out in the harbor. It was a routine born of isolation, a quiet safety that often felt more like stillness than true peace. Sarah loved this town, loved its people, the way they knew each other's names and waved from their porches. She felt a deep, almost maternal protectiveness over this place, a determination forged in her own quiet strength to keep the darkness at bay, even if that darkness was usually just the lonely quiet of the night itself. Tonight, though, a subtle tension pricked at the edges of the usual calm. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling, a low thrum beneath the surface of the quiet streets and the gentle sweep of the lighthouse beam across the water. Her gaze swept the darkened storefronts, the black rectangles of house windows, each one a miniature mystery in the night. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, amplifying the smallest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a gull, the quiet creak of the patrol car's suspension. It was the hour when the world felt most vulnerable, and Sarah felt the weight of that vulnerability settle onto her shoulders, a familiar burden she bore with quiet resolve. She felt the subtle shift in temperature as she rounded the bend, heading out towards the northern coastal highway, away from the town's scattered lights and into the deeper, more encompassing dark, where the cliffs drop sharply to the unseen sea below. The old Crown Victoria rumbled along the winding county road, its headlights carving tunnels through the oppressive rural darkness. Sarah gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, just slightly, a familiar tension she carried in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. The air was thick with the damp scent of pine needles and rain-soaked earth, a smell as ingrained in her memory as the worn leather of the driver's seat. Her patrol route was etched into her mind, past the sleeping farms, the dark stretch bordering the old timber forest, the turnoff for Harper's Creek. She had handled a couple of noise complaints earlier, the usual Saturday night fare, and stopped for a few minutes near the deserted general store, watching the dust motes dance in her high beams, enjoying the rare, uncomplicated peace. There was a simple rhythm to these nights, a quiet competence she felt, navigating the familiar curves, the solitude a balm after the day's small-town dramas. But tonight, the rhythm felt subtly off, a low hum beneath the surface of the ordinary. Miles out, where the paved road gave way to a rougher track leading nowhere specific, the sweep of her headlights caught something unexpected. Pulled hard onto the overgrown shoulder was a sedan, its windows dark, no hazard lights flashing, engine silent in the vast quiet. It was parked at an impossible angle, facing away from the road, almost as if it had veered off intentionally or been shoved there. Sarah slowed, a prickle starting at the back of her neck. "That's not right," she thought, her internal monologue instantly shifting from comfortable routine to cautious alert. No visible driver, no signs of a breakdown, just a dark shape against the deeper darkness. She pulled alongside, hitting her spotlight. The powerful beam sliced through the night, fixing on the rear of the car. A dented bumper, faded blue paint, an empty interior visible through the back window. The silence outside her car was absolute, amplifying the sudden frantic beat of her own heart against her ribs. It felt like the landscape itself was holding its breath. She reached for the radio mic, the plastic cool and smooth beneath her trembling fingers, intending to report the suspicious vehicle. But something about the stillness, the unnerving sense of presence emanating from the dark car, made her pause, her breath catching in her throat. She never got the chance to transmit. The early morning light, thin and gray, sliced through the Venetian blinds in the sheriff's office, painting pale stripes across the worn linoleum floor. Dust motes danced lazily in the beams, oblivious to the knot of tension tightening in the room. Betty, the dispatcher, usually the picture of calm routine, chewed her lip, eyes fixed on the radio console. Sarah's 10:14 check-in was overdue. Then the 10:30. And now the 1100 was silent too. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, began to prickle beneath her skin. It wasn't like Sarah. She was meticulous, always on time, her voice bright and professional over the airwaves. Sheriff Brody leaned against the counter, nursing a lukewarm coffee, the gurgling of the pot a hollow sound in the growing quiet. He tried a casual, "Anything from Sarah yet, Betty?" but his voice held an edge. Betty shook her head, her gaze flicking to the clock. The static hum from the idle radios felt amplified, mocking the silence from the one channel that mattered. Officer Miller ran a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps. Maybe her battery died, or she's helping someone. Stuck out on County Road. They voiced possibilities, but the forced optimism felt thin, brittle. Betty tried again, her hand trembling slightly as she keyed the microphone. Unit 3, come in, Sheriff's Office calling Unit 3. Only static answered, again and again. Each silent response chipped away at denial, letting fear seep in. The sunlight now seemed harsh, exposing the worry etched on every face. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken dread. They all felt it. The sudden, terrifying vacuum where Sarah's presence should have been. It wasn't just a missed check-in anymore. It was an absence, vast and terrifying, expanding with every silent second. The routine pulse of the office faltered, replaced by a frantic internal drumbeat of panic. The world outside the striped windows seemed too calm, unaware of the sudden chasm that had opened in their small, predictable world. Someone had to go look. The word spread through the small department like a shockwave. She was gone. Radio silence turned to frantic calls, then to a chilling realization. The patrol car hadn't checked in. Adrenaline surged through the short-staffed team. Officers, pulled from desk duty or off hours, scrambled into their cruisers, the familiar hum of the engines now laced with dread. The immediate search effort exploded outwards, a desperate spiderweb cast over the night. They retraced her known patrol routes first, cruising along the quiet coastal highway, eyes straining against the darkness, searching for the distinct gleam of her patrol car's paint, the flash of a reflector, anything out of place. Their headlights swept across empty fields, illuminated stretches of deserted beach access roads, and cut through the dense fog that had begun to roll in, thick and suffocating. They checked the usual spots. The turnouts where officers sometimes took a moment, the small parking lots by the pier, the winding back roads notorious for late-night speeders. Every ditch, every embankment along the local roads became a potential accident site, a pit in their stomachs twisting tighter with each empty glance. Hope fought a brutal internal battle against rising fear. Maybe she just had a flat tire, the thought whispered, a fragile shield against the terrifying alternative. Maybe the radio died, but deep down, a colder certainty began to creep in. A pro like her wouldn't just go silent without calling in trouble, not unless something serious had happened. They drove with windows down, listening, trying to pierce the night silence with the whine of sirens or the crunch of twisted metal, hearing only the relentless crash of waves and the mournful cry of distant gulls. The hours stretched, marked by the changing shifts in the damp night air, the growing ache in their backs, and the dwindling supply of hot coffee from the station. Each passing minute without a sign chipped away at their initial, frantic energy, replacing it with a leaden weariness and a gnawing despair. The roads they knew so well felt alien and menacing in the searching light, holding their secrets stubbornly. The initial hours yielded nothing, the silence deafening, pushing the searchers towards the terrifying conclusion that she wasn't just somewhere on her route. She might be somewhere far worse, somewhere hidden, requiring a different kind of hunt altogether. The air in the sheriff's office thickened with stale coffee and unspoken worry. Desks were piled high with paper, the ordinary rhythm of small-town crime replaced by a frantic, unfocused energy. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face wore the lines of 40 years' service, officially opened the file labeled Missing Person, Sarah Jenkins. The weight of the words felt heavier than any case file he'd ever held. Alongside him was Detective Miller, younger but with eyes that had seen too much too soon, his usual brisk efficiency faltering in the face of a void that swallowed explanations. This wasn't a simple runaway or a temporary absence. It was a person, vanished without a trace from her own familiar world. They moved through the formal motions, the interview rooms cycling through a parade of distraught faces. Sarah's parents arrived first, their grief a raw, palpable thing that clung to the sterile air, their voices thin with shock as they painted a picture of a loving, responsible daughter with no reason to leave. Friends came next, paint still smudged on their hands from the local art class Sarah attended. Their voices hushed, disbelief etched on their faces as they spoke of her warmth, her laughter, her unwavering presence. Colleagues at the station, awkwardly professional, offered stilted compliments on her dedication, subtly avoiding eye contact with the empty desk that had been hers just days before. Each interview echoed the last, a frustrating chorus of positivity and normalcy. Sarah was stable, happy, looking forward to her life. No enemies they knew of, no secret troubles, no plans to disappear. Just Sarah. Meanwhile, patrols scoured the town grid, the rugged coastline cliffs, the sparse roads leading inland, the silence amplifying the growing unease. Her small apartment yielded nothing concrete. No signs of struggle, no packed bags, nothing out of the ordinary, save the chilling silence that now resided where her vibrant life had been. The patrol car remained a phantom, adding another layer of dread to the mystery. As the hours bled into days, the initial flurry of tips, false sightings, Vague rumors born of small-town gossip evaporated like morning mist under the sun. The pinboard in the makeshift incident room remained starkly bare, the hopeful red pins marking potential leads never materializing into solid information. Miller ran a hand through his thinning hair, staring at the large-scale map tacked to the wall, the vast blank space where Sarah should be marked only by the circle denoting the town limits. Brody sighed, the sound heavy in the quiet room. They had pursued every angle, every possibility, and found only emptiness staring back. The silence in the room wasn't just an absence of noise. It was the deafening sound of a case going cold before it had even begun. They looked at each other, seasoned eyes meeting across the cluttered desks, the unspoken question hanging heavy between them. How could someone simply disappear? It wasn't just baffling. It felt fundamentally wrong, like a tear in the fabric of reality. The frustrating lack of answers gnawed at them, a cold, hard knot forming in their stomachs. A young woman, a protector of their peace, vanished into thin air from her own familiar territory, leaving behind only confusion and a profound, terrifying absence. There was nothing tangible to chase, nowhere definitive to look. Brody picked up a small framed photo from his desk. A picture of Sarah, smiling brightly from the station picnic last summer. A simple moment of everyday life that now felt achingly distant and tragically symbolic of all that was lost. The photo felt heavy in his hand, a reminder of the real person behind the missing person report, amplifying the sickening realization that they were at a dead end. But as Miller stared at the map, a tiny detail nagged at him. A routine noise complaint reported unusually late that night, dismissed as nothing significant at the time. A heavy quiet settled over the small coastal town like a damp blanket, replacing the usual murmur of daily life with a constant, low hum of anxiety. On the main street, faces wore a mask of weary concern. Eyes darted nervously towards the empty patrol car parking spot outside the station, a stark visual reminder of Sarah's absence. Inside the local diner, where coffee cups usually clattered against saucers and laughter echoed, hushed conversations replaced the cheerful din. Waitresses moved with a noticeable stiffness, their smiles gone, clearing tables that felt too large now, too empty. Fear, insidious and cold, coiled in everyone's stomach, a fear that didn't have a name or a face yet, only the chilling reality that one of their own had simply vanished. Rumors, wild and varied, circulated like a disease, whispered across backyard fences and debated in hushed tones at the grocery store, each one more fantastical or terrifying than the last, amplifying the collective dread. But the true epicenter of the storm was Sarah's neighborhood, a cluster of houses that now seemed to sag under the weight of grief. Her house, in particular, stood silent and watchful, lights burning at all hours, a beacon of unbearable sorrow. Inside, her parents existed in a cruel purgatory. Every phone call, every knock on the door sent their hearts lurching, a desperate, raw surge of hope, quickly crushed by the familiar, disappointing news, or the lack of any news at all. Her mother paced the floor, her hands twisting a worn handkerchief, her gaze fixed on the front door, willing her daughter to walk through it. Her father sat hunched in Sarah's favorite armchair, running a trembling hand over the worn fabric, the scent of her perfume faintly lingering, a bittersweet torture. They fought the crushing weight of despair with fierce, protective love, clinging to the smallest possibility that she was still out there, somewhere. The injustice of not knowing ate away at them, a corrosive acid dissolving their peace, their sleep, their very will to function. It wasn't just her life that felt stolen. It was their ability to mourn, to find closure, held hostage by the void she had left behind. The town held its breath, waiting, watching, praying for a sign. Any sign that might break the suffocating silence and point towards where their missing policewoman had gone that fateful night. Years bled into years, marked by the deepening layers of dust on the Sarah Jenkins case file stacked high on a forgotten shelf. Outside the station windows, seasons cycled relentlessly. Harsh winter rain drumming against the glass, followed by the deceptive bloom of spring, the thick heat of summer, and the brittle whisper of autumn leaves scattering across the pavement. The initial frantic energy of the search dwindled. Resources redirected to newer, louder tragedies. Investigators who had pored over maps, chased down dead ends, and interviewed tearful witnesses were reassigned, their faces etched with a weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. The bulletin board where Sarah's smiling photo had once held pride of place eventually became crowded with other missing persons, other unsolved crimes, her picture fading slightly at the edges. For the family, the passage of time brought no solace. Only a heavier burden of unanswered questions. Every birthday, every holiday, every passing siren was a fresh stab of pain, a stark reminder of her absence. The silence from the department grew, not out of malice, but from a crushing lack of progress, a helplessness that infected the very air of the precinct. Most detectives moved on, their frustration hardening into acceptance, but a stubborn few, their eyes still holding a spark of unresolved anger, couldn't let go, pulling the heavy file down occasionally, flipping through brittle pages, hoping a detail they missed would finally leap out. The scent of aged paper and stale coffee clung to these solitary vigils, a tangible manifestation of the stagnant truth. It felt like standing at the edge of a vast, dark ocean, knowing something was down there, but having no way to reach it. The file remained a monument to a life cut short and a mystery that refused to yield its secrets. A silent challenge, waiting for a new wave to wash something unexpected ashore. Decades later, the Blackwood Lake sat silent and still under the harsh afternoon sun, its surface reflecting the sky like dull glass. Locals usually avoided it, whispering about its unnatural depth and the strange cold that seemed to cling to the air nearby, even in August. Its shores were overgrown and forgotten, a place where memories sunk like stones. But now, the drought had changed everything. The water level had dropped dramatically, exposing stretches of cracked mud and tangled roots that had been hidden for generations. A new context arrived, not with construction noise, but with the quiet hum of desperation. The town needed water, and hydrologists were surveying every local source, including the deep, dark heart of Blackwood. The air held a peculiar tension. The familiar calm of the neglected lake was now laced with an unsettling mystery, a quiet anticipation that something long buried might soon see the light. From the dusty ridge overlooking the lake, she watched the surveyors move slowly along the exposed banks, their bright vests stark against the brown landscape. A knot tightened in her stomach, a feeling both of dread and a perverse kind of hope. She hadn't been here since she was a child, when her mother would warn her about the lake, telling ghost stories that now felt horribly real. The sight of the shrunken water body stirred a deep pool of nostalgia, tainted by the sorrow of her mother's absence. This place, this deep, silent lake, had always felt connected to the mystery, a dark mirror reflecting the town's unspoken fears. As the surveyors edged closer to a particularly murky inlet, Her heart pounded against her ribs. She remembered her mother mentioning something about this part of the lake. A place she said felt especially heavy. Was it possible, after all this time? A gust of wind swept across the ridge, carrying the faint, earthy smell of exposed sediment and something else, something metallic and faint. Her gaze locked onto a glint in the mud, near the inlet, half hidden by withered reeds. It was just a tiny flash of color, insignificant to anyone else. But to her, it felt like a pulled thread on the fabric of time, hinting at what lay beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The choppy surface of the remote lake gave little indication of the silence that had settled over the shoreline. A small crew, huddled against the chill air, watched the faint ripple of the dive team's activity below. 13 years felt like an eternity compressed into the anxious wait, each second stretching taut. Below, in the murky, lightless depths, something substantial was being explored. The diver's voice crackled through the speaker, muffled and hesitant, describing a large, angular shape partially buried in the silt. Hope, a fragile thing nurtured over years of dashed expectations, flickered. Could this finally be something? Not just debris, but something significant? Tension coiled tighter as the description grew more defined. Metal, rusted but solid, a curve that seemed too familiar. A collective breath was held on the shore as the retrieval process began. Winches groaned, ropes strained, pulling against the weight of 13 years of water and sediment. Slowly, painstakingly, the object began its ascent. The dark water churned, revealing just the faintest outline at first, a shadow against the gloom. It rose closer, the shape becoming undeniable, distinct from the rocks and fallen trees that littered the lake bed. It wasn't a boat, not wreckage from a storm. It was something vehicular. As the top edge broke the surface, glistening and dripping, a gasp went through the onlookers. The unmistakable curve of a roofline, the solid mass of a trunk. And then, as more emerged, the detail that stopped hearts and stole the air from lungs. The iconic, faded blue and white paint scheme, the remnants of a light bar. It was undeniable, horrifyingly clear. Pulled from the silent depths was the vintage patrol car. Her car. The shock was immediate, visceral. A cold dread washed over everyone present, extinguishing the fragile light of hope and replacing it with a chilling, concrete reality. The car was here, which meant what else was still inside its rusted cage? The implications settled like the silt from the rising vehicle, heavy and suffocating, promising answers no one was truly ready to face. The recovery site hummed with a grim efficiency, but for the cluster of veteran officers gathered near the rust-scarred vehicle, the air felt thick with 13 years of unspoken history. The sedan, still dripping lake water onto the muddy ground, lay like a wounded beast under the glare of portable lights. Sergeant Miller, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there when Deputy Jenkins vanished, knelt first. His gloved hand, steady despite a tremor just beneath the skin, brushed away caked mud from the rear bumper. The dull metal of the license plate, though corroded, held its familiar sequence. He didn't need to read it aloud. A collective sharp intake of breath rippled through the small group behind him. This wasn't just a car. It was the car. Another officer, his eyes reflecting the harsh work lights, ran a hand over the disintegrating remnants of the sheriff's department's star, painted on the door, the familiar outline a cruel mockery against the ruin. Inside, the waterlogged interior offered a glimpse of sodden seats and a dashboard warped by time and submersion, a silent, chilling testament to its long rest beneath the waves. The final, irrefutable confirmation came when they located the VIN plate, hidden near the firewall, painstakingly cleaning it until the serial numbers emerged, cold and precise. Miller stood slowly, the movement stiff with both age and shock. It was her patrol car, number 247. The knowledge settled heavy and cold in their guts, a bitter confirmation of fears long suppressed. Sadness mixed with a rising tide of indignation. How could this happen? How could she have ended up here, discarded with her vehicle like forgotten wreckage? The quiet confirmation morphed into a shared, intense urgency, replacing the lingering threads of hope they hadn't realized they still held onto. The car's identity was verified, but the true questions lay within its waterlogged secrets. The air around the retrieved patrol car hung thick with the smell of stale ocean and something far worse, a cloying, organic decay that turned stomachs. Detective Miller stood back as the team carefully pried open the passenger door, a groan of protesting rust echoing in the quiet morning. 13 years the ocean had held its secret. 13 years everyone believed Sarah had simply walked away. Now, the truth was being forced into the light. Molecule by agonizing molecule. Miller watched the forensic techs, their movements slow, reverent almost, as they navigated the muck-filled interior. Every scrape against submerged metal, every soft splash in the pooled water inside, felt like a violation. He remembered Sarah's easy smile, the way she always polished her badge until it gleamed, proud of the uniform. He pushed the memory down, focusing on the grim reality before him. Then, a hush fell over the scene, heavy and absolute. One of the techs, face pale beneath the grime and sweat, gestured wordlessly towards the driver's side. Miller stepped closer, bracing himself, his breath catching in his throat. There, tangled in what remained of the driver's seat upholstery, was the devastating confirmation. Skeletal remains, unmistakable, woven into the fabric of the tragedy. A small, tarnished badge lay nearby, partially obscured by sediment, no longer gleaming, only mocking the years of neglect. Sarah. The name echoed in Miller's mind, a mournful bell tolling through the quiet morning, amplified by the distant cry of a gull. All those years, the missing posters, the theories, the whispers of desertion, she had been here, trapped, forgotten, swallowed by the indifferent sea at the base of that remote cliff. A wave of raw, gut-wrenching sorrow washed over him, quickly followed by a hot, bitter anger. 13 years of injustice. 13 years she lay in the dark, while everyone assumed the worst. Assumed she had simply abandoned her post, her life, her friends. The mangled steel of the patrol car offered no immediate answers as to why it plunged into the abyss. Only the horrifying certainty of who was inside. A discovery that screamed for answers about the last moments before its descent. The cold light of the forensic lab seemed to flatten the world, leaching color from the rust-streaked hulk of the patrol car and the carefully laid out, fragile pieces of bone. Dr. Evelyn Reed leaned closer, her magnifying goggles pushing the intricate patterns of decay into sharp focus. Decades underwater had not erased everything. They had merely transformed the evidence, layering time and the ocean's touch over the violence. Her team worked around her, a quiet hum of motion and hushed voices, their faces etched with the intensity of purpose. Brushes softer than artists' tools swept away sediment, revealing the stubborn metal beneath, scarred and corroded. Every dent on the car's frame, every shatter pattern on the remaining glass, every piece of mangled upholstery inside the submerged cabin told a story the victim never could. They were hunting for silent answers, signs of forced entry, trajectory marks from a potential struggle, foreign objects lodged in the muck. or damage inconsistent with the natural forces of the ocean and time. Dr. Reed's gaze shifted to the examination table where the remains lay. The bones, brittle but remarkably intact, held their own secrets. She looked for signs of trauma, a fracture pattern, a small indentation, anything that spoke of force or injury before death. "Speak to us," she willed silently. "Tell us what happened." The air hung heavy with the past, thick with the metallic tang of rust and the faint, sweet decay of organic matter. It felt like listening across a vast chasm of time, waiting for a whisper. A technician near the driver's side of the car made a soft sound, a sharp intake of breath. Dr. Reed turned, her heart giving a sudden heavy lurch. There, lodged deep within the corroded mechanism of the door lock, almost invisible against the rust, was a tiny, misshapen piece of metal, completely out of place. It was small, insignificant-looking, yet utterly foreign to the car's original components, a silent scream unearthed from the depths. Finding it was like finding a keyhole in a wall of silence, a promise that the years of waiting might finally yield the truth they sought. This small piece of evidence could change everything, potentially naming the hands that had silenced her. The air in the cramped archive room hung thick with the scent of aged paper and settled dust, a quiet, tangible history pressing in. Surrounded by stacks of faded folders from 1977, the investigators hunched over their task, the weight of the years momentarily lifted by a fragile, burgeoning hope. The discovery of the submerged patrol car had cracked open the long-closed book, illuminating pages previously dismissed as irrelevant. Detective Miles, his face illuminated by the harsh overhead light, ran a finger along a typewritten line in a witness statement from a woman who claimed to see an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the old lighthouse on the night of the disappearance. A detail logged but never pursued. Beside him, Agent Davies carefully unfolded a brittle, hand-drawn map of the area, comparing it to modern satellite imagery. The car's location, so remote and unexpected, suddenly made sense of old, cryptic notes about logging roads and forgotten trails. They sifted through suspect lists, names scanned with fresh eyes, evaluating not just their alibis, but their potential connections to the isolated stretch of coast where the car was found. Every seemingly insignificant detail from the past, a reported argument, a strange vehicle, a local's alibi that felt slightly off, was now viewed through the lens of the horrifying truth the rust-eaten patrol car had revealed. A sudden, sharp intake of breath from Miles broke the silence, his eyes fixed on a handwritten note scribbled in the margin of a supplementary report. It mentioned a distinctive landmark near a rarely used access point to the cliffside, a landmark previously thought unrelated to the main investigation area. The world outside the dusty room vanished. In that instant, the decades of unanswered questions seemed to converge on this one forgotten observation. A tangible path forward, hidden in plain sight all along, suddenly materialized from the brittle pages of the past. The stale air of the war room hung thick with the scent of old coffee and worn paper, a quiet monument to years of dead ends. Hours blurred into days as the team sifted through boxes of brittle files, each document a ghost of faded hopes and unanswered questions. Detective Miles Corbin leaned against the edge of the table, eyes tracing the tangled web of connections on the whiteboard. A decade's worth of frustration etched into the lines around them. He felt the familiar weight settling in his chest, the quiet despair that maybe, just maybe, they had missed it, or that it simply wasn't there to find. The silence was punctuated only by the rustle of pages and the soft glow of the desk lamps, illuminating weary faces. Then, Sarah, the analyst poring over the original witness interview transcripts from 1977, stopped. Her breath hitched slightly, a tiny sound that cut through the quiet like a snapped wire. She had pulled a handwritten note from the margin of a police officer's summary of an interview with a local fisherman, known for his wild stories and heavy drinking. At the time, the officer had deemed the comment tangential and the witness unreliable. The note, scribbled almost as an afterthought, mentioned seeing that funny old service van, the blue one with the dented fender, near the remote bluff just after dusk on the night the young policewoman vanished. Sarah had cross-referenced this against old county maintenance logs recently digitized, records they hadn't even known existed during the original investigation. The description of the van, its specific make and the unusual fender damage, matched a vehicle assigned for maintenance to a county property worker who had a known, albeit minor, prior conflict with the victim, a conflict never deemed significant enough then. A collective stillness fell over the room. Miles pushed off the table, his movement slow, disbelieving. The air crackled with a sudden, potent energy, replacing the fatigue with a jolt of raw adrenaline. This wasn't just a detail, it was a key, small and overlooked, that could potentially unlock years of silence. The fisherman's sleeting, dismissed comment, corroborated by dry official logs 40 years later, pointed a trembling finger towards a scenario, towards an individual, previously shuffled into the periphery of possibilities. A fierce electric current of determination surged through the team. Weariness evaporated, replaced by sharp, focused urgency. Miles felt a prickling behind his eyes, a sudden, intense hope that tasted like grit and possibility. Every eye in the room was fixed on the whiteboard, on the space where this new lead would be grafted onto the sprawling timeline, shifting the weight of the investigation entirely. The board, previously a map of dead ends, suddenly felt like the threshold of a future they hadn't dared to imagine. It was time to follow the ghost of a blue van down a road they had never traveled. Years scraped by, but the rust wasn't the only thing that lingered. Investigators, haunted by the cold salt spray clinging to the recovered wreckage, found their focus sharpening on a man whose name surfaced in old neighborhood watch minutes and faded business ledgers from '77. They spent days sifting through the dust motes dancing in sunbeams, slicing into the suspect's musty old workshop, the air thick with the ghost of machine oil and sawdust. Each discarded tool, each stained floorboard whispered possibilities. They cross-referenced decades-old witness statements, vague rumors from a time when people spoke less freely, with the grim specifics the ocean had finally relinquished. The angle of the impact on the patrol car, the precise method used, the specific knowledge required to navigate that treacherous stretch of coastline late at night. It all aligned, chillingly, with the suspect's known skills, his past grudges, his calculated movements documented in entirely separate contexts. Inside the sterile quiet of the precinct conference room, surrounded by corkboards blooming with photos, timelines, and forensic reports, Detective Miller felt the weight of 45 years settle onto his shoulders. He looked at the face of the young policewoman in the photo, so full of life, now a symbol of a gaping wound in the town's history. He saw the suspect's photo next to it, the eyes flat and unassuming, masking a long-held darkness. Decades, Miller thought. She waited decades for this. The motive, initially murky, solidified into something stark and petty. A perceived slight, A moment of careless power leading to irreversible horror. The pieces clicked into place with a dreadful finality. The argument that night, the pursuit to the cliff's edge, the deliberate act of violence, disguised as an accident the sea would claim. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and impending justice. A profound weariness settled over Miller, mixed with a surge of fierce protective resolve. The truth was unmasked, raw and devastating, and the time for waiting was over. The sterile hum of the fluorescent lights seemed too loud in the quiet room, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing within its occupants. Decades had passed since Sarah vanished into the cool California night air. 33 years of silence and agonizing uncertainty that clung to her family like a shroud. Now, gathered around the polished conference table, her aging parents sat across from the detective who had unearthed the truth, their faces etched with a lifetime of sorrow, anticipation, and a fragile glimmer of hope. The detective, bone-weary but standing tall, placed the final evidence folder onto the table with a soft thud that echoed in the stillness. Inside lay the irrefutable proof, pieced together meticulously from the salvaged patrol car and painstaking cold case work. The specific tool marks on the steering column, the unique fibers found tangled in the damaged door panel, the killer's discarded, damning item recovered years later from an unrelated search warrant, and finally matched through advancements in forensic technology. As the detective calmly, clinically laid out the timeline of Sarah's final moments and the killer's clumsy attempt to conceal his crime by pushing her car from the remote cliff, the air thickened with the weight of the revealed horror. A choked sob escaped Sarah's mother. Her father reached across to grasp her hand, his knuckles white. This wasn't just a case summary. It was the dismantling of a lifetime of unanswered prayers. The detective confirmed the apprehension. The killer, living a quiet, unsuspecting life for all these years, was finally in custody, confronted with the evidence he thought buried forever beneath the waves. A collective exhale swept through the room. It wasn't happiness, not entirely, but a profound, cleansing release. The phantom limb of uncertainty no longer throbbed with every unanswered question. Justice, delayed for over 3 decades, finally settled upon them. Heavy and solemn, Sarah's parents clung to each other, tears streaming, eyes closed. For the first time in a very long time, they could breathe. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, mournful stillness. The path ahead, though still shadowed by grief, felt strangely, finally clear. The memorial stone stood stoically by the harbor, polished granite catching the diffused sunlight of late afternoon. Engraved upon its surface was Sarah Jenkins' name, flanked by 2 dates and a simple star. A hush fell over the small crowd gathered there, a quiet reverence that had replaced the years of murmuring speculation and lingering sorrow. The sheriff, now gray at the temples, stood beside the stone, his gaze sweeping across the faces of townsfolk. Faces etched with the lines of time and the weight of a secret finally unearthed. This simple act of remembrance, years after the truth of that brutal night emerged from the ocean depths, felt like the town finally exhaling. Back in the sheriff's office, the case files were officially closed, stacked neatly, no longer holding the suffocating weight of the unknown, but the solemn record of persistence. Detective Carter, alongside the now-retired Captain Evans, looked at the files, a quiet satisfaction mixed with the lingering sadness for the time stolen. The life lost. Their relentless pursuit, the years of chasing down cold leads and wrestling with official resistance, had finally paid off. It was a testament that some truths, buried under years of silence and doubt, could still fight their way to the surface. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town square where children played, a scene of simple, unbroken life. The resolution of Sarah's case hadn't erased the past, but it had lifted a communal burden, allowing a different kind of hope to take root. The hope that even in the deepest shadows, justice could find its way. The air carried the faint scent of salt and blooming jasmine, a sensory reminder of life continuing, resilient and enduring. The quiet hum of the town, settling in for the evening, provided a backdrop to this newfound peace. Special epilogue. Years later, the stone memorial remained, a quiet sentinel against the coastal winds. New generations grew up knowing Sarah Jenkins' story, not as an unsolvable mystery, but as a somber lesson in the enduring power of truth. The investigators, their names less known to the public than Sarah's, carried the quiet satisfaction of their victory, not just for her, but for the principle that no life is too insignificant to be forgotten, no crime too old to escape accountability. Sarah's memory wasn't just a name on a stone. It was woven into the town's fabric, a reminder that hope, though sometimes deferred, was a force worth clinging to, a light that could eventually pierce the darkest night. The conclusion. The salt-laced air was cool against his face as he walked along the empty beach. The tide whispering against the sand. The case was closed, the names spoken, the answers found. There was no triumph, only a quiet ache, a dull throb of exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. The faces of the grieving, the years lost, the sheer, senseless waste of it all looped gently in his mind, not with sharp edges of pain, but a muted, pervasive sadness. He felt distributed, his emotions scattered like the pebbles under his feet. A little relief, a lot of weariness, a vague sense of accomplishment, overshadowed by the irreversible finality of death. Justice delivered didn't bring Sarah back. It just rearranged the existing sorrow. He stopped, looking out at the vast, indifferent ocean. A lone seagull cried overhead, a mournful sound against the rhythmic sigh of the waves. He turned back towards the town, towards the faint glimmer of lights beginning to appear in windows, small beacons against the encroaching darkness. He walked towards the lights, towards the possibility of a quiet meal, a simple evening, carrying the quiet weight of his work, a weight that was now a familiar, if heavy, part of him. He saw not a grand victory, but simply the path ahead, an open door leading into the muted comfort of everyday life, carrying the small, fragile flame of knowing that sometimes, against all odds, the darkness could be pushed back just a little.